Good morning guys, Teddy here and welcome to Teddy Games, the most inconsistent show on the internet where we do different things every single day involving video games and game development. Today we're going to be talking about particle effects, and for the sake of actual time of uploading and getting this thing done on time, it's actually going to be a lot shorter than every other episode, so no time to waste! Roll that intro! So welcome to the world of Unity, where we cover up our mistakes with actual particle effects, which is pretty much everything I use them for. Of course, particle effects are one of the most important things in the entire gaming industry because it gives a lot of movement, it gives us a lot of life to games. I thought we'd just have a casual talk about particle systems. So the first thing you are going to notice is that when you create a particle system, there are a whole bunch of drop down boxes and stuff like that which you can check to enable, and then of course change the settings for them. It's a fairly simple process. Right now I've actually just created a little fire particle, and the idea behind it was that it's actually top down so that the fire is coming towards the screen. How do we give this effect some life? Of course, because it's 2D and top down, we don't actually need much depth. That's just not the nature of this kind of aesthetic. So all I've done is actually made it spawn in from a specific area, and the way that we work with things like emissions is actually by giving it an area or a direction that it can actually spawn and move towards. So we're just going to talk individually about how to actually make the particle system work. Under the shape, you're going to get given a little drop down box of all the types of shapes that you can have. Once you've actually enabled it, you always need to have sort of an emission shape. If you don't want an emission shape, they're just going to spawn in a particular point of the actual game object's position in 3D space. Of course, this is a 2D game, so why would we need a 3D sort of space? We don't want the particle systems coming towards the camera, we don't want them going away from the camera. Even though we are working in 2D, it is technically a 3D space. In order to achieve this, Unity actually just takes away the perspective and changes it to something we like to call orthographic, which is pretty much a perspective where there is no perspective. So underneath the shape, there's no point in me using something like a sphere because a sphere is actually 3D, so instead we are going to use something called a circle. Hopefully you guys all paid attention in kindergarten or preschool and you guys know what a circle is. Basically within that circle is our spawn area. By default it's actually a straight line because it's on the wrong axis, so what we just do is switch the x-axis to 90 degrees and you get a nice circle that is facing towards the camera in the perfect position. And then of course we just need to spawn some particles, and every time we do, it actually comes within that circle somewhere. They spawn randomly within the circle by its default settings. Of course you can change the radius if you so want to. You can change a lot of settings in there, make the shape any kind of shape you really want. The cone is a bit more directional, however again it is in 3D when it comes to a cone. If you want it not to be in 3D, then select the circle and actually change the arc of the circle, which is the outside ring, so you can kind of make it's like a pizza. It's like taking away slices of a pizza. Where do you want the particles to spawn? Where the pizza pieces actually are. So in order to get this cone effect, we could of course leave cone, but then we're adding an actual depth to the way that the particles actually spawn. We don't really want that. We want it to spawn on a 2D plane, so we can change the arc to create kind of an area in which it will actually spawn, which will be sort of like a wedge. So it's going to spawn, and any speed that is actually added to the particle will actually move outward from the very center, which is the very tip of the pizza wedge. Of course, within shape, you can actually randomize the direction of which direction your particles will actually go, and you can use that as an area instead of a single direction. There are so many settings. I can actually make an entire video just talking about shapes and stuff like that, but of course that would be pretty boring. I'm sure it's pretty boring already. So we're actually going to move on to something called emissions. Now emissions are a little different because emissions are how many particles are actually spawning. Well, it controls how many particles kind of spawn. So we got a few settings here. We've got rate over time, we've got rate over distance, and of course then we have burst. Now of course if we want an explosion, we just want the burst effect to come out. We want a burst of about 50 or 100 particles to actually come out. We don't want to have them constantly spawning out at random times. So when it says rate over time, that means every second there are going to be 50 particles that actually spawn if we leave that at 50, or we can change it to 10, so over the course of a second there will be 10 particles that actually spawn. Then of course if you want an explosion, you can always use the burst feature, which is pretty much creating a burst of how many particles you want, so instead of over a second, it's all instantaneous. Of course if you want multiple bursts of the exact same effect, you can actually turn looping on, which is in the top kind of section of it, and what that will do, which means burst, and then once of course that duration has ended, it will burst again and again and again. It's a really fun thing to play with. Whenever I create particles, there are certain things that I use particles for and certain things I don't. For example, the leaves falling from the trees in the game A Lovely Morning. That effect was actually really easy. All I did was create a little leaf, which again I describe as looking like a drumstick from KFC, but I just created that leaf and then I kind of spawned it within this area that I've made as a box, and then of course it's just got a little bit of gravity to it, so it falls at a very slow pace, but it doesn't kind of have any movement. Now I wanted a little bit of wind, so I added some velocity on the x-axis, which means it's being pushed to the side, and for every single particle of course you have to do the same thing, or else, you know, because wind doesn't go like this. I mean, sometimes it does, but, you know, all the leaves kind of fall in the same direction, but now I kind of wanted it to be a little bit more random because wind is not really predictable. It can move a little bit, so what I do afterwards is actually add something called a noise layer. So as it moves, it actually is affected by the noise layer and gives it a little bit of kind of movement like that. Make sure that the frequency is very slow so that instead of just falling in that direction, it falls like sort of this and like speeds up and slows down a little bit. That's exactly how wind works, and that's how the leaves kind of gave the game kind of a nice effect. Of course, the particle system alone does not guarantee that the effect is actually going to work, so other things that you can add to it was, of course, the grass is waving, and of course I just use Unity's default wind effects for the actual grass. When it comes to fire, it is incredibly similar except on a much smaller scale. For example, you want to spawn your particles within a very small area, and of course if you want those particles to kind of raise up in the air in a random direction, it's the exact same thing, except we take gravity off and we actually add a velocity on the y-axis so that it actually goes up because, you know, heat raises up. Then of course the only thing that's actually missing with the fire is the fire moving up in random directions, which of course we can add a noise component in our particle system, and what that does is just kind of makes it a little bit random as it goes up as fire behaves, because, you know, heat just is again unpredictable, just like wind. So we have wind and fire, we just need the earth. Do you remember? September. So for the sake of comedy, we're actually going to talk about Earth. So when it comes to Earth, you can, well, let's say we have an effect where you step on the ground and there is a little bit of a dirt trail. They do stuff like this in Minecraft, I guess, and Terraria. Basically, you just want to add a lot of gravity to something like that, and also you want to make it simulate with the world and have collisions with the world, so when it lands on the ground, it actually stays on the ground and disappears in a different way than just sort of fading out or disappearing instantly. What we could do is actually make the particle sizes go smaller as if it's seeping back into the ground. We have a lot of effects that actually changes size and color and velocity over time. We've talked about velocity, especially when it comes to the fire effects and of course the wind effects as well. You want a little bit of velocity to that. So the way to get this effect is to add collisions onto it and then of course change your size over time to actually have a curve, and you want that curve to sort of dim itself down over time. So once the particles actually land on the ground, then of course it's just going to get smaller and smaller until it disappears completely. And that's the cycle of particle systems. You want them to appear in a natural manner. You don't actually want them to just appear, unless of course that's the effect that you're going for. For example, explosions are very, very fast, which kind of means that yes, they can just appear and kind of just burst out. It's really up to you how you use it. I've talked about emissions, I've talked about shape, velocity I've talked about, color I've talked about, size I've talked about, rotation over lifetime is another one that I didn't actually use, but what would be good if those leaves that were falling down actually had a little bit of rotation to them. Actually, maybe they did have rotation to them. I can't quite remember. Pretty much rotation speed kind of acts with the noise layer as well, so that you can make things sort of turn as they flutter down when it comes to the leaves. So if the pixels are turned slightly to the left, people are going to go, wait a minute, this doesn't look right, because it doesn't look right. They're supposed to kind of stay aligned with each other, even though they have very unpixelated movements. So I've talked about noise, collisions. Oh, there are trails, but I never really use trails, but basically it's just a texture that can be stretched behind the actual particle. So the final thing to talk about is the renderer, which is extremely important because this is actually what's showing the particle. What does the particle actually look like? Of course, it's basically just a normal material. You can change it in any way. You can make the material look different, but usually if you are working with stuff like fire, you want to make sure that the shader of your material is set to like particle, and then there are a whole bunch of stuff there. There's alpha blends, there's additives, which are pretty much just different blending options or just different ways that the actual material is shown. If you have something like additive, then when one particle is over another particle, they actually add the colors to each other, so it gets either brighter, which is usually the case, they get brighter, and of course they get sort of mixed between it, so it's just a brighter version of the colors of the two particles meeting together. Anyway, the materials are kind of just there for very 2D looking particle systems. systems. We can actually move to 3D. In my case, I've used it for Skyroar, for example. When the blocks actually explode, they just smash a whole bunch of little blocks away at each other, and this is a 3D mesh. So by spawning in a 3D mesh, of course, it's going to use a lot more data or a lot more CPU or whatever to actually display the fact that there are little blocks everywhere and they have gravity added to them, they have collisions added to them. This is a lot of particles that are actually doing a lot of hefty work when it comes to stuff like CPU. So the opportunity is actually there to make 3D particles, 2D particles, and of course there are many other ways that you can actually do it, but usually setting the material to something really good is very handy. I would recommend that a lot of people actually use 2D particle systems whenever they're doing, for example, even a high-end game, when they're doing spells and all that type of stuff. And to be honest, guys, the only way that you guys can actually learn this is by fiddling around with these knobs. Just read what they actually say. I mean, come on, max particles, that's pretty obvious. It's the maximum amount of particles that can be active at once. Duration, again, is obvious. It's how long the particle system actually lasts for. If it's set to looping, it will last forever, but it's how long it will take until it actually resets itself. You got so many things here to play with. Gravity modifier, you got your start color, randomized rotation. It's pretty simple. You just change the numbers around. And of course, if you want to make randoms between two numbers, this is something I use a lot, guys. I make a random number for stuff like size, because I hate it when particles are all the same size. It just doesn't look natural. It doesn't look really right. What I do is there's actually a little drop down menu which you can change to stuff like curves. Usually I do random between two constants, and the constants are just numbers. So if I want a particle to actually spawn between, let's say, the size of 1 meter and the size of 50 meters, then I will just put 1 and 50. So anything in between, it will randomize the number for every single particle that's created, and it'll give you a nice range of sizes. Now there's one more thing that I'm going to talk about. Pretty much, again, I'm going to say this again and again, the only way you can learn this is just by fiddling with it, guys. It's not something that needs a tutorial. You guys just need to kind of use it. You guys need to understand how it works yourselves. It's very hard for me to explain it. It's very hard for me to show it. And if I start showing you how to make a fire, you're just going to copy everything down. So I'm pretty much explaining to you how to make a fire, because a good teacher shows you where to look, but not what to look at. Apparently someone said that, and it's written on my board. Anyway, I've taken up far too much of your guys' time. Thank you very much. If you found this helpful in any sort of way, then you can always like the video or just leave me a comment asking any more questions that you guys kind of want me to answer on the next Banana Bread, which is next week on Thursday. Also followed by a lot of social media links, including our Discord server, which is the Tater Games Dev Squad, where everyone goes to talk about video games. Or just spam the chat channels with memes and stuff like that. Anyway, thank you very much, guys, for watching. I'm going to go have a great weekend. Hopefully you guys are inspired to start creating stuff for the weekend. As always, send me all your projects. Usually Discord or Twitter is the best way to actually send me screenshots of your stuff. I love seeing what you guys actually make, and of course I'll keep up to date with all of you guys' work as much as I can. So have a great weekend, everyone, and I'll see you next week.